Hello and welcome, Mrs. Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. In this video, I'm sharing mini stencils with big impact. I'm using the new stencil deck from Lisa Horton Crafts. This has 52 mini stencils in it, perfect for creating all sorts of different backgrounds, textures, prints, and patterns on your projects. Now, these are 2 inches by 3 inches, so they're a lot smaller than, say, the size of an average A2 card, but you can easily move them to create a larger pattern, or you can use them just to create a little bit of pattern on the background of your projects, or even on die cuts inside stencil images, like inside little areas of stencils. You can add a little bit of pattern for those background patterns. You can see as I'm putting them out here, there's a lot of different variety in those patterns. I'm going to create 4 different cards using 4 of the stencils, but obviously with 52 of them, there's many more that you can choose from, as well as it's easy to swap out the ones that I use for other ones as well. I'm using them along with some older products from Lisa Horton Crafts. I'm using the layered Anemone die, the Gladiolus die, the Wildflowers die set, as well as the 2 Stampin' die sets for sentiments, the Sending Smile sentiments, as well as the Very Best Wishes sentiments. But in these cards, I'm only using the stamps from those sentiments. I'm going to stamp those sub-sentiments on black cardstock with white embossing powder, and then I'm going to trim them down. Now you could, if you wanted, use the coordinating dies from these sets and die cut them, but I didn't want the rounded edges that those dies created. I wanted them to be just sentiment strips. So I'm choosing to use my trimmer to trim them down once I'm done embossing them. So I have some black cardstock here. I'm using my embossing powder tool on that cardstock so that when I pour that powder on there, the powder sticks to the embossing ink. I'm using some super fine powder to get really good detail. Now, if by chance you get a few grains of that embossing powder somewhere else on your cardstock where you don't want it to go, just use a soft brush and brush it off before you melt it. Then I'm using my embossing tool to melt that powder on the cardstock, and I love the look of the bright white on the black cardstock. Now, another thing you could do here, if you wanted it to be a different color instead of bright white, you could take a Copic marker and you could color that embossing. You do want to do it quickly, and you don't want to go over it too much because Copic markers, alcohol markers, do start to break that down. But if you wanted to, say, in this video, I'm using some pinks for my florals. If you wanted the sentiments to be pink, you could easily pick out a Copic marker that coordinated with that and use that so that we would have pink sentiments on black. So that's another way that you can customize it and change the way that your card looks. Now I'm using the stamp set from the other set. I'm going to do exactly the same thing. I used embossing powder tool on that black cardstock, stamped it with that VersaMark ink, and then I poured that powder on there. Use that little soft brush to remove any embossing bits that aren't stuck to where they want. And especially when you're using white on black, you really do notice if there's a few crystals where you don't want them to go. So you definitely want to clean that off. Once I'm done heating it and embossing it, I let it cool for just a few moments, and then I'm using my trimmer to trim that down. Now, when I do this, I'm using that clear finger guard there, the right side of it. I'm looking to the right side of it, seeing just a peak of those letters and making sure that they're nice and even, and then using the guillotine part of the trimmer to trim that down. Then I flip it around and I do exactly the same thing, but this time when I do that, I also look at the left side of the sentiment and make sure that it's straight on that metal guard to make sure that I have a nice straight sentiment, and then I trim off the ends. So off screen, I did the rest of those sentiments. I have far more sentiments that I'm going to be using in these videos, or this video, but what I do is I save it with that Stampin' die set, so the next time I go to create a sentiment, I might already have a previously done sentiment that will work for the project that I'm doing. So for my first card, I'm using the layered Gladiolus die set. Now I have all of my pieces die cut out of black and white cardstock for all my florals for my cards, and I'm using the inks to color those die cuts. Sometimes I'll ink them before assembling them. In this case, I wanted to assemble them before inking them, partly because some of those die cuts are really, really tiny, and partly because it creates a really unique look for the die cuts when I assemble them ahead of time and then layer them together. For my leaves and my stems, I have them die cut out of black cardstock, and then I'm inking them with Under the Sea Color Shift ink. Now, Color Shift ink is very similar to interference ink. They have two properties to them. One, that is the look that you get on white or light cardstock. Second is the look that you get on black or dark cardstock. So for this particular, for these leaves and stems, I'm looking at the color that it shows up on the black or dark cardstock. In this case, it's at like a tealy green. There's not really one that has a green for the Color Shift inks. I'm just doing it towards the top of the stem. So those are the areas that are going, the top of the stems and leaves, those are the areas that are going to be that tealy green, and then the bottoms are going to stay black. For my flowers, I'm using Color Shift ink in Magenta. And then for the buds, I'm using a little bit of Garden Sage towards the bottom, and I'm using that Magenta on the top. Now, when I'm using, or when I'm ink blending with these inks, I'm using the Lisa Horton, the 1-inch brushes. So they're really nice and soft. They've got a flat end to them. And when I'm using them on the assembled flowers, we're gonna get different amounts of ink in different areas. It's going to catch a little bit more on the edges of those flowers than it is on the recessed areas. So it creates a really unique look to it. To intensify the color around the edges, or the edges of the cardstock pieces, as well as adding a little bit of shimmer, I'm using some Fruit Punch Color Shift ink. So that's just going to add it around the outside edges, just the same as using the other brushes with the Color Shift ink. It's the amount of ink around the outside edges are going to be heavier than inside. So I like the look of the combination of look between the matte blending ink and the Color Shift ink. The contrast between the matte and the shimmer is really quite pretty. The background for this card, I'm using the Diamond or the Harlequin stencil. I have some Best Ever craft tape that I'm taping around the edges. Now, I have put that tape on my shirt a couple times to take away the excess sticky. This is just going to help it stay in place. For some of the other ones, I don't use the tape. Actually, this is the only one that I use the tape on. Wasn't sure if I really liked the tape. I like that it keeps that stencil in place, but it is a little bit more of a pain to be lifting it up to move it. So for the other ones, I just hold it down with my fingers. You can see when I do that, sometimes it works well, sometimes it doesn't, because sometimes it'll move because there's nothing holding it down. But I also didn't want to chance ripping the cardstock. Even though I've taken some of that sticky off with that Best Ever craft tape, sometimes it sticks really, really well in certain areas and can chance ripping that cardstock, and I didn't want to do that. I have these pieces trimmed down to 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches. Typically, I will do my technique or whatnot and then trim it down afterwards. For this, I wanted to trim it down ahead of time because I didn't want my pattern going all the way out to the edge. So by trimming it down ahead of time, I know exactly how much space I have to work on, and I don't accidentally go a little bit farther than I really want to. However, if you want your pattern to go all the way out to the edge, you absolutely could do that. It's just not the look that I wanted for these particular cards. For all of my cards, I'm using black mats that are trimmed down to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. All of my die cuts either have black on them, or I have my sentiments that are on black cardstock. So that black is going to frame it really nicely, and it's going to coordinate with, if not just the sentiment, it's also going to coordinate with the die cuts as well. Some of my cards don't have black die cuts, but I tie it in other ways. So once I have my matte and my upper layer, my stenciled layer on my A2 card base, I can start to assemble the die cuts on there. So I'm starting with the stems and the leaves. This is just going to give me a base for putting those flowers on. The flowers go on top of the stems. Now you could, if you want, assemble the flowers onto the stem before putting it on the card. I typically like doing it afterwards for this particular die set, simply because it just gives me a better idea of how much space I have, and I can change where I want those florals to go if I so choose while I'm assembling it. Now, in the end, I chose to put those flowers exactly where they were intended by looking at the front of the package, but you certainly could change them up if you want. I'll have some of the buds or some of the smaller openings to the flowers towards the top, and some of the smaller flowers, and then the larger ones towards the bottom. And because these are gladiolas, you can really get creative with your color palette if you want. I chose this pinky corally color. I just thought it was really pretty, and I tend to lean towards pinks, but if you prefer like yellows and oranges or whatnot, you could easily do that, or even I think red would be perfect for this as well and would have a lot of impact. So once I have my flowers done, I'm ready to add my sentiment. Now you could add it flat to this piece here. I like how much texture and how much dimension we get from the die cut gladiolas though. So I opted to use a little bit of foam tape on the back of that sentiment to put it on there and give that some dimension as well. So I put it over the base of the stems, and here we have our completed card, and it comes together really quite well. I think it took longer to die cut the different flowers for the different cards than it did to stencil and assemble them. But I love the final look of them. For just a touch more sparkle, I added a little bit of stickles to the centers of those gladiolas. I often love adding stickles to the centers of flowers just for that little bit of sparkle. The one that I use is iridescent, so it's transparent. You can see the color of the cardstock or the ink underneath, so that doesn't hide that. It just adds that texture as well as that sparkle, and it gives the cards just a little bit more texture than just die cuts and inks alone. For this next card here, I'm using the Wildflowers die set. So I have them all die cut out of white cardstock. I'm layering those pieces together, and then I'm using the inks to color the cardstock. Now, I like the look of ink blended die cuts. I think it makes them look more interesting than flat colored cardstock, but you certainly, if you want them to be more evenly colored, you certainly could use colored cardstock here. I just like the look sometimes of seeing ink blended white cardstock. It just gives it a bit of a different look to it. For the centers of the flowers, I use that Fruit Punch Color Shift ink. For the flowers themselves, I start off with the Magenta matte blending ink. Then I go in and add that Color Shift ink to the center because I wanted it to have a little bit of sparkle. Now this is where I didn't really think things through. What I should have done was cut the centers of the flowers out of black cardstock and then use that Fruit Punch Color Shift ink on there, and it would have shown up just more like of a gold color because that's the interference color to that particular color shift palette. What I end up doing is adding just a little bit of black ink over top of the centers of the flowers just to tie that black in a little bit and make sure that the centers of those flowers show up a little bit more. So for the background for this one, I'm using this stencil that kind of has coffee rings and splatters. For this one, I didn't put it in place, and this is one of the ones where you can see that it moves on me while I'm stenciling, partly because when I'm stenciling, I'm using a fair amount of pressure. My black pad here, I keep it fairly dry because I like to use it for techniques with interference inks, and I don't want to have a lot of moisture to it and have it not dry on its own. So you'll see as I'm using it that it does move on me because I don't have that stencil on the Tacky Mat. It doesn't have anything to stick to, so I'm just using my fingers to hold it in place. So for the look that I was going for, this worked for me. I wasn't going for anything pristine and perfect because it's coffee rings and we're doing ink blending with it. It didn't need to be perfect for me, but if you prefer to have a little bit more control, then I definitely would recommend taping it down. You can see towards the top right corner there, right by the rings, I got a little bit of ink on my cardstock background. I intend to put a flower there, so that's going to cover that. So when I make little mistakes like that, I'll typically find creative ways to hide them. I always find that when you make little mistakes like that, to me, they're creative opportunities. There are ways to just change things up and think a little bit differently and go a little bit outside of what you had already planned. So after seeing those flowers together, again, they didn't have enough color, so I added the black to the center. They look much better. They tie in with the background a lot better, and we're ready to start assembling the card. So for gluing all of my card pieces as well as die cuts together, I'm using some Barely Art glue. I have it in a fine line bottle, so it works perfectly for assembling my cards. It also works perfectly for assembling my die cuts. When you use liquid glue, it gives you that little bit of wiggle room to move and shimmy things in place, and I like being able to move and shimmy things in place and not have to get it down perfectly the first time. The other nice thing about it is as you're working, if by chance you have to lift something up to tuck something underneath, like for instance a leaf or whatnot, it works easily to do that. It starts to dry fairly quick-ish, but you still have some wiggle room while it's drying to be able to move and shimmy things. You'll see as I do it, I'll typically put the stems on the flowers so that when I put these stems, or when I put the flower stems on the background of the card, I can see where things are intended to go. I can figure out, or I can cover the space how I want it to. Then I will typically add the leaves to it. Sometimes I'll tuck the leaves underneath the stem. Sometimes I will tuck them underneath a leaf that I had already put down there. So it's nice to have that liquid glue to be able to change that up just a little bit. I'm also going to put foam adhesive on the back of this sentiment. However, you could easily just glue it down flat if you want. You'll see typically I put my sentiments right on my stems. I don't want to cover my flowers. I don't want to cover a whole lot of that background. So I'll typically put it over stems, usually closer to the bottom because it's not really a very pretty area there. So there's a lot of space to work on. Just like the last card, I added some stickles to the centers of the flowers, just to the upper layer die cut that is on that flower center. I still want to see that black behind it. I don't want it to be completely covered. And I think it looks a little bit more interesting when it's not completely covered. For this next card here, I'm going to use the poppy die that is from the Wildflowers die set. Once again, have these pieces die cut in white and black cardstock. So the flowers and stems as well as leaves are die cut out of white cardstock. The inside or the center parts of the flowers are die cut out of black cardstock. So I'm starting off with ink blending with that Andy Magenta on the centers of the flowers, keeping it darker or keeping the ink darker towards the center, lighter towards the outside. I think when the inks are different amounts, like when you have lighter ink in one area and darker ink in another area, it just has a more interesting look to it. So that's why I kept the outside of the flowers fairly light, if not white, because I wanted them to have a different color tone than the inside of the flower. For the stems, once again, I'm going with that garden sage. And when I'm ink blending those stems, I'm fairly even all the way, and then I add a little bit more ink towards the bottom, so that we have a little bit of color variation. Because those stems are really quite tiny, they do like to move around on that tacky mat while I'm ink blending them. So you don't really have a ton of control. But again, if you prefer them to be completely solid, green cardstock would work perfectly for that. So once I have those flowers layered together, I'm layering the centers of the flowers. There's two kind of half circles that have like a ruffly or jagged edge to them. One goes towards the back. There's a circle that goes in the middle, and then one goes towards the front to create that flower center. It's hard to see when you layer black cardstock on top of black cardstock to be able to see those details in there, but they're really quite easy to know how to layer them together. For this background, I'm going to use this little plaid stencil, but I don't want to stencil it in the center of the card. For this one, I'm going to stencil it around the outside edges and then fade it to nothing in the center of the card. Now for these backgrounds, for these cards here, I'm using the Cloud9 matte blending inks. You could easily use a different type of ink. Another option would be to use like texture paste, or even to use Stickles glitter gel to add that texture to those backgrounds. For the look that I was going for, I wanted ink on these, but you can use those stencils with many different things. And again, even though they're mini stencils, you can, when you're working with inks anyways, you can match up the pattern and create a larger area. Harder to do with texture paste because you need to wait for it to dry before you can match up the next area if you wanted to do it that way. But you can put little bits of texture in different areas and it creates a really unique and interesting look to it. So you can see when you have patterns like this, they're really quite easy to match them up to create kind of the look of a larger stencil. It does take a little bit more time than having a larger stencil to work with, but I love the variety and the range of variety that you get in this set. So there's a lot of different pieces to choose from. And I also think, I didn't do it in this video, but I also think it would be really fun with these mini stencils to add that stenciled pattern to die cuts before assembling them and create a really unique look that way. So once we have my stencil background done, I added that to the card base, and now we're ready to add the flowers and the stems. And here you can see with having that liquid glue for gluing the flowers down, I was easily able to just tuck that leaf underneath that stem. I didn't adjust or move a whole lot. The flower went right back in place, but it's nice to have that little bit of wiggle room to be able to tuck things underneath each other as you're working, just because sometimes when you're creating, you're thinking about certain things, but you don't necessarily think about every possible scenario. And I didn't really think about adding those leaves to the first flower before adding the stem and flower of the second one. So for this one, I have two sentiments here that I'm adding together. So once again, adding that foam tape to the background of them, just to give them a little bit of dimension. Wanted it to have dimension, but not as much with foam tape. You could always use strips of cardstock behind, and then you would control how much dimension your sentiments would have there. So I'm adding the bottom sentiment first, putting that down, and then adding the second sentiment just so that I can get the spacing right. And then once again, I'm adding a little bit of stickle close to the center of the flowers. So for this particular one, I'm just adding them to those ruffly edges on the 2 half circle shapes. Not covering the entire black center of it. Again, I think it looks more interesting when you have a little bit less than if you completely cover that center. For the last card, I'm going to be using the layered Anemone set, and I'm going to do this with some of the metallic inks. I love Lisa's metallic inks, so I thought it would be fun to use those metallic inks on some black cardstock die cuts. For the centers of the flowers, I have those die cut at a white to give it a little bit of contrast to the flower petals themselves. Now, I layered those together with that liquid glue, let that dry for just a few moments before doing my ink blending on the die cut pieces. You could ink blend those layers to the center of the flower separately if you want and then add them to each other. It's not going to really make any difference for the look of it. So for my leaves and stems, I'm using the Mojito pad, and I'm concentrating the ink towards the top of the stem and the top of the leaves. For my flowers, I'm using the Love Struck pad, and I'm concentrating the ink around the tips of the flower. So the center of the flower is the black cardstock and just the color is around the tips. And as it dries, if you want the ink to be a little bit darker, what I typically will do is I'll let that ink dry for a few moments and then I'll just go back over it again. It kind of builds up on that black cardstock. I'm using the gold ink pad to the right for the centers of the flowers to give them some nice gold centers. So we don't have white die cuts in the center. It's going to have that gold in the center of it. I'm also going to use that gold for my background stenciling to tie that in there. So we're layering these pieces together. They're always really easy to layer together. If by chance you don't know exactly how to layer them together, it's really easy to look at the cover or the front of the die cut piece to see how they're intended to go. Here I have these flowers with this petals cupped up. You can also do them with the petals cupped down if you want to have just a little bit of a different look to them. Now I have a black mat here for my card. For this one, I'm going to use that Love Struck pad and I'm going to ink that black cardstock so that my mat ties in or brings out the color that the flowers were ink blended in. Easy to do, a great way to customize and have your mat match your cardstock or match your die cuts perfectly by just using that same ink pad on top of that die cut or on top of the mat. So I'm using this heart stencil for the background. There's a few different heart stencils to choose from in this set. I chose this particular one. I'm just adding that ink blending in the center. I chose to do gold for this one because I thought the black die cuts on top of the gold stenciling would look nice. It will also bring out the centers of the flowers like I said before. So once again, you can do as much or as little stenciling as you want. If you want, you can do it all the way out to the edges. I do think it looks a little bit more interesting though when it fades out into nothing. Now we're ready to start adding or start layering our pieces on top of our card. So I put the mat that had that Love Struck ink around the outside edge on there first. Then I'm putting my stencil piece in the center of it. Next, we're ready to add our flowers to it. And you can see how quick and easy these cards come together. They come together super quick and super easy, but I love the look of them all together. And if you wanted to add a little bit more texture, you could add that texture paste or use glitter paste on the backgrounds as well. And you can even get texture paste in like metallic colors or mix in mica powders with it to customize the colors to go to it. It just really depends on the look that you're going for. And if you love doing like mixed media types of things, then you're likely always looking for stencils to add pattern and texture. And I love the fact that this deck has 52 different cards or stencils in that whole set. So once again, I'm adding stickles to the center of the flower and I put my sentiment on foam tape before adding it to the card. Here is the finished result once that has dried. And I love the look of that gold background tying into the gold center of that flower. But the flower with the black cardstock and the metallic ink around it really has a striking look on that background. Then we have our layered poppy card with the plaid stenciled background. And again, you could do that stenciling over that entire background, but I think it has a lot more interest to it by not having it stenciled in the center. Then we have the coffee ring stencil with the layered daisies. I think it's supposed to be daisies. I did it more like echinacea in the centers and then black in the centers, and then our layered gladiolas. You'll find everything that I've used listed and linked down in the description box below. And if this is the type of video that you like, please hit subscribe and join us again on another day. I thank you for all the time that you spend with me. I really appreciate you being here. I hope you have a fantastic day.